We're going to have some adultery and murder this morning in church, but we'll try and keep it in the pulpit, not get beyond here. Great story. And this is another example of the kind of narrative theology that the Bible is full of, where we pull stories of how God works in our lives from the illustration in the lives of other people here. And David, and what David goes through at this point, and how he has progressed since we last saw him. We had a little clip before David and Goliath. That was our last meeting with him in that place. But here we see him with a different, this isn't David and Goliath, this is David and Bathsheba, or as someone else put it, David and Bathsheba bears it all. Bathsheba, it literally means daughter of Sheba, so that's nothing to do with that, nothing to do with bathing. She just happens to be having a bath here in this. But Bathsheba and this subject, like many of the biblical stories, artists over the years have taken them and brought out what they see in these stories. This is Rembrandt. I don't think there's a little detail there. She's got a lady doing her toenails. Well, this was, according to Jewish tradition, the time of the month when ladies did your toenails. So when you had your purification bath, and if I were in acceptable Jewish quarters today, I could happily ask ladies, which one of you on your period today, so I know not to touch you after the service. It's not quite like that today. But for them it was very, very important. And so this is one. She's having a hair done and her toenails clipped after that. This is Ricci, another picture of her. And she's always presented as slightly wealthy and with attendants there and a screen round her to protect her modesty. Not quite sure how David managed to get round all of those. I think she definitely wasn't like this one. Any of you recognise this? Susan Hayward, that's right. Smile on her face, peering over the screen. That's from the Gregory Peck film, David and Bathsheba. We'll see another one of Gregory Peck later, looking quite a young man, very dashing, there. But I found one of the covers for that film was this one. And you see it as mighty as Goliath. And you've got Goliath at the top and Bathsheba at the bottom. And it's interesting, isn't it? That David, though he was young, though he was relatively inexperienced, though he wasn't anybody in Israel, yet he was able to face up to what appeared to be Israel's greatest enemy, and he stood there and he smashed Goliath. And yet later on in his life, he comes across a different circumstance, and one which undermines his life and his ministry, effectively destroys his witness to the Lord in a very, very different way. You'd have thought that someone who could deal with Goliath should have been able to deal with Bathsheba. Or maybe I shouldn't say should have been able to deal with Bathsheba, but should have been able to deal with the devils within, which led him into that place where he was unable to cope with what came to him in the person of Bathsheba. I don't think it was particularly her fault. Though you might wonder, what on earth was a lady doing having a bath out in the open where she could be seen? But we'll have a little look at that a bit later. But it was definitely David dealing with his own weakness. And what I hope to bring out today is something of that. Whilst we might be able to deal with a Goliath, it's probably more important we're able to deal with our weaknesses within, which can cause us to face a situation like that and really go under. Now, what had happened between the two? This is like, you've got to imagine the video again now. This is like meanwhile back at the ranch. Okay, this is what goes on. We're going to try and fill in the details between David and Goliath and David and Bathsheba. Because some of these details actually explain some of what's gone on. Goliath was a lot easier in some ways because Goliath was a clear enemy. There he was, this great big hulk of a man who was defying Israel and defying God in the process. David comes along, stumbles across it like this, and finds the resources in his own experience to be able to deal with that situation. Now, some things happen which change that situation. David became famous through all of this. He was a nobody before that. You know, when Samuel went to anoint Jesse's sons looking for the king, he went through 7, and Jesse said, well, I've got an 8th one, but, it's David. He was a nobody. And suddenly, he was catapulted to fame. And a bit like Justin Bieber, he didn't know how to handle the fame which landed on his doorstep. Now, Justin Bieber's just got baptized. We'll see if that helps him get back on track, see where he's going with it. Do you know that? In June, baptized in a bathtub in New York. Anyway, unable to handle the fame which came to him. You know the song that Israel used to sing? The maidens would go out dancing, and they would say, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Imagine this, David listening to that. Oh, Saul his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Whew, that's me. All these ladies dancing round. You become the focus of attention like that. And so it's natural maybe that in that situation Saul became jealous. Just as David was unable to deal with the sexual temptation which he faced with Bathsheba, Saul was unable to deal with this attack on his prestige and on his power. He became jealous. He attempted to murder David. So David had to flee, and off he went, and he spent years living in the wilderness. He was a bit like a Robin Hood. He said, I'm not sure he gave to the poor. He just stole from people. He lived as a bandit. He had this group of merry men who went round sacking places and making sure no one was left alive so no one could say who had done it. And that's how he lived. He went off to the Philistines, his enemies. At one point, he pretended to be a madman. He had saliva dribbling down his beard to try and stop himself from getting killed. He had some low moments. But within all of that, somehow he remained faithful to God and faithful to the vision that God had given him that one day he would be king. He refused to kill Saul, even though he was his enemy, because he saw that God would bring him to the throne in his time, and he tried to live faithfully within the life that God had given him as he understood it. Eventually, Saul went down this murkier and murkier road, getting himself into more and more difficulties. Saul got killed in battle. Civil war broke out in Israel, and the people of Israel came to David and said, you're the one that God's anointed. Will you be our king? He said yes, took Jerusalem, united the kingdom, and there was David, king of united Israel, sitting in Jerusalem as the king over all of this. And basically, David had arrived. And I imagine him sort of looking back and just thinking, whoa, this is it. King of Israel, my wives here, my enemies subdued, my family members installed, I've got my cousin here, my uncle here. Everything's going swimmingly. Fantastic life. And you know, that is the time when you have to watch out. When you're living in the desert, when you're pretending to be a madman, when you're running from someone who's after you, maybe it's easier to live in faithfulness to God. But when you're there, and when you've arrived, and when everything's rosy, suddenly our dependence on God starts to seep away, and we find ourselves somewhere else. You may know the phrase, pride goes before... not quite, actually. That's what the Bible actually says. Pride goes before destruction. And haughtiness before a fall. Okay, it's not that different, I know. I'll make a big deal of that. But pride, when a person allows, pride is that feeling of having achieved something yourself by your own ends and by your own means, rather than seeing ourselves and all that we have as the gift of God, and knowing that all that we are is by the grace of God. God took David from being a shepherd boy and made him into king. There was no reason for pride on David's part, and yet somehow he was unable to cope with the pressure of success, and he allowed pride to get to his head. And once you do that, you start taking decisions which aren't really very wise. And this is where David starts to do things which he shouldn't really. Chapter 11, starts off saying it was springtime. And spring was the time when what? Well, they do that as well. That's not what the Bible says. Kings go off to war. That's what they did. It's a bit like here, we have the summer sales and, Christmas. Well, springtime, it's time to go to war. That's what kings did. Once the mud had started to clear, the rainy season's over, you can get out there with your chariots. Off you go and fight a few people. Life was different in those days. Okay, it's not quite what we live today. So in the time when the kings go off to war, what did David do? But David stayed in Jerusalem. He sent Joab off to battle. He sent the army off to conquer the city. And he stayed in Jerusalem. No army, no friends, No work, because you're supposed to be in the battle. What's David doing? Twiddling his thumbs. And you know that this isn't in the Bible, but you know it says, idle hands. What happens with idle hands? The devil finds work for them. Well, an idle hands, an idle mind. It says, late one afternoon, he got up after his nap. Now, there's nothing wrong with a siesta. Right? In Spain, in the summer, when it's 38 degrees, they recommend that you have a siesta in your pajamas, 3 hours. There's nothing wrong with it. But this is springtime. It's hardly the hottest time of year. Late afternoon, he gets up after his nap. He's sleeping. The first thing, he slept. And then he wanders around on the palace roof. Now, the way houses were built in those days, you would always have a courtyard. If you go into North Africa today and ever staying in a house up in the mountains in North Africa, the houses are built around courtyards because the courtyard is where the animals are, it's where the kitchen is, and it's where the bathroom is. And a law of etiquette within this kind of society is that you don't look down into your neighbour's courtyard. It's a bit like here. In Spain, they wouldn't quite understand it the same way, but here, people don't tend to have curtains necessarily on their windows. And as you're walking along the road, people are sitting there watching the telly with the window, the curtains wide open like this, the lights on, and you can see everything that's going on. But you don't stand and gawk, do you? Depends if they've got Sky and you haven't, and Liverpool-Everton's on, then you might. But there's a code of etiquette, though you can see, you don't look. And so David in the palace is the highest house. Of course it's going to overlook the courtyards of the other houses around. I don't think that Bathsheba was up on the roof going, whoo, like this. She was getting on, as we'll see in a moment, with something that she had an obligation to do according to Jewish law. Off he goes round here, and he starts to look. And he peers. Now, John talks about this in 1 John. He talks about the temptation that comes in through looking. Now, looking and seeing are two different things. Luther said you cannot stop the birds from flying over your head, but you can stop them from making a nest in your hair. It's the same with seeing and with looking. Guys, pretty girl walks past. No problem. Guys, pretty girl walks past. Slightly more of a problem. Right? We can control our look, even if we can't control what we see. And one of the things, vision is very, very powerful. And looking, this is why visual media and visual advertising is so powerful. As we look and dwell and feed on visual images, they create desire within us. Whether that is pornography, or whether it's a fashion catalogue and new clothes, new handbags, new cars, whatever. It creates desire within us which isn't necessarily there. That's why we have to be very careful about where we look and how we look, because spend too long looking at the wrong things in the wrong places, and you will start to create desires within yourself which you will then have to cope with. So the best thing is to learn not quite to look in the same way. But he didn't just look. After he'd looked and dwelt a while, then he inquired, and he sent someone. Go and find out who it is. So off they go, knock on the door. Excuse me, who are you? Oh, I'm Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. Why? Oh, nothing. Go back to David. It's Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. Now you know David. She might have been a young maiden waiting to be married. It was okay for a king in those days to have 3 wives. Now he knows that she's married. Now he knows that she is off limits for him. So what does he do? He sent for her and brought her back. Now, sin is rarely conceived in a moment. Sin is the product of a process. It's a series of small steps, so that when you get to the edge and fall off, rarely have you taken a giant leap from where you were to where you're going. But you've taken a series of small steps, which means that the final small step, as Bathsheba walks in that door and stands before him, and he says, this way, love, or whatever it was he said to her, that was a small step because of everything that had gone on before that. Now, I'd like to point something else out with this, which just brings a little element into the story which perhaps we haven't, from a Western perspective, considered. It's using a Hebrew word, nida, which means unclean. You know, like the lepers in the films, unclean, like that. It's a word that was applied to anything within Jewish law which was considered unclean. And a woman, when she was in her menstrual period, was considered unclean. A few texts from the scriptures about that. Whenever a woman has her menstrual period, she'll be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. When the woman's bleeding stops, she must count off 7 days, then she'll be ceremonially clean. It's not about whether you're clean as in had a bath or not. It's about ceremonial cleansing. It's about ritual purity. A woman in this period, there are a series of stipulations. Once your bleeding had stopped, you counted off 7 days. Now just think about that a moment. A period will normally last something like between 5 and 7 days. Then you count off another 7 days. That's between 12 and 14 days. Now those who understand these things, when does ovulation occur? About 12 to 14 days after the start of the last period. What's Bathsheba doing? She is having her ritual bath, which you have when you've counted the 7 days since the end of your last period. So she is absolutely in her most fertile moment. Ovulation occurring as David calls on her. I think David may have understood some of these things, but at this point, didn't care less. She was fulfilling the duty that she was supposed to. Now it's interesting. Scripture says clearly that a man and a woman are not supposed to have sexual relations during her period of menstrual impurity. And there was a punishment being cut off from the community for both a man and a woman if they were to engage in sexual relations during this time. So it's very interesting here when David calls for her, and then it says he had sex with her, the writer puts in brackets, she just finished her period of ritual cleansing. She was no longer ceremonially unclean. What a statement. 3 days earlier, David might not have had sex with her. Why? Because she was ritually unclean. But after 3 days, because she's now clean, he can sin to his heart's content. He's somehow blinded to the real heart of morality and to what sin is in its offence against God. He's a religious legalist, like the Pharisees, who Jesus said, you swallow a camel and yet you strain out a gnat, a little fly. When they had wine, have you ever had wine in hot countries and the fruit flies gather round, you get a little fly in it, and you pick it out and say, cough it up, I paid for this. But I know, bad. But the faithful Jews, they would put a filter on the wine as they drank it because they didn't want to drink an unclean insect. And he said, you're swallowing a camel. And that's what religious legalism does. It makes us obey the rules. Do this, do that, don't do the other. Wear this, don't go there, don't act in that way. But it becomes a straitjacket of outward behaviour that has no relevance to our heart. And here David, it seems he's concerned, phew, she's had a bath, that means we can go to bed together. Never mind the consequences, and never mind the moral heart that's in here. Like that. That's just something which might help you to understand as a Jewish reader of that time would read this situation with the background which was natural to them. Now David's gone and done it. And I sometimes ask the question, what would have happened if she hadn't got pregnant? I don't know how that would have continued, and we don't need to bring conjecture in there. But she does get pregnant. And word gets back to David, so I suspect he hadn't seen her. I think it was a one-night stand. It was a moment of lust. He saw this naked woman. It incited lust in his heart. And as he was king and powerful, he said, I'm going to have her. And he did. And then he cast her off. But sin breeds sin, and word gets back to him that he's pregnant. Like that. Everyone knows that her husband is away in the army. And so that means there's going to start to be inquiries as to who's done it. He can get away with it maybe, but now she's pregnant. Something's going to get exposed. So he is now afraid of the consequences of his sin being exposed, and sin breeds sin. Like they say, lies have short legs. One lie leads to another one and to another one. You have to try and cover up, and that's what he does. So he tries to cover his tracks, and first of all he gets Uriah and says, come back for a weekend. Come to the palace. I imagine Uriah the Hittite, he wasn't a Hebrew. He may have been a mercenary soldier. He says, come to the palace and have a feast with me. So Uriah's sitting there, oh, this is nice. Dinner with the king. Woo. Then off you go home. And he doesn't go home because Uriah, as you've seen in the reading, was an honourable man. And he chose to identify with the army that he served with rather than go home and sleep with his wife. He's a man who's been away. Men, understand this? You've been away for a couple of months in the battlefield. You get the chance to go home and sleep with your wife. What would you do? It says something about his character there. So he tries to cover his tracks by bringing Uriah back. But then because Uriah is too honourable, he tries to corrupt him. He tries to get him drunk, first of all. Well, that's an interesting concept as well. We won't go into that one. If someone's drunk and you send him home to sleep with his wife. We're not going to go down that road. But he corrupts him, first of all. And then he corrupts Joab. He writes to his army commander and says, take this guy and get him killed. Drawing people into his own sin as it expands there. And then finally, of course, murder. He is not the material author of the murder. But definitely in Scripture, he is considered as the one who is responsible for Uriah's murder, like that as Uriah is killed. That's the lengths that David has got to in this place. Now can you see the contrast? David and Goliath, David and Bathsheba. In one, he's victorious. In this, he is totally flattened and totally knocked out. And this is where the part we didn't read, you've got to read it yourself, it's the next chapter, chapter 12 in 2 Samuel. This is where Nathan comes in. Now I have a huge admiration for Nathan. The prophet Nathan comes along, and you've already seen what David is capable of. He was a despot, he was an authoritarian ruler, already got other people killed. And Nathan comes along, and very cleverly tells him this little story about a man who had a lamb, he brought it as his own, and the whole story there, using parables to bring something through into David's life. David gets really angry with this story. He says, that man deserves to die. And then Nathan's words come through and say, you are that man. Powerful words. And this is where I think we also have to come back and say, well, yeah, David was flattened through this. But we still have to realize that David was a man after God's own heart. Why is that? Well, because maybe there, but for the grace of God, are any of us. But David was a man who, when faced with his own sin, and when he heard the rebuke which came from God via his prophet, he said, quite simply, he said, I have sinned against the Lord. David had an open heart, despite his obvious failings. And we're talking about here about taking steps which leads to adultery, and then leads to murder, leads to inciting other people in this way. Obviously, it's serious stuff we're talking about. But somehow, underneath all of that, here was a man whose heart was open towards the Lord and said, I have sinned against the Lord. And you know, one of the most beautiful psalms, most quoted psalms that we have, Psalm 51, that the heading in the Hebrew psalm says, this was a psalm that was written after David had sinned against God with Bathsheba. And he says things like this. I'm not going to read the whole psalm again. Take it away and read it yourselves. But he says, have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love. Because of your great compassion, blot out the stain of my sins. Wash me clean from my guilt. Purify me from my sin. It's interesting, Bathsheba, he spotted Bathsheba as she was going through ritual purification to cleanse her from the taint as the Jewish people saw it of that moment in a woman's monthly period. David now calls on God for that same cleansing, not a ritual cleansing outwardly, not a bath where other people could see him, but a cleansing of the heart. And he calls us, wash me clean from my sin, purify me from my guilt. He knew a God of grace, he knew a God of mercy, and he knew a God of forgiveness. Even though the consequences of his action, he still had to bear those. Terrible division, incest, violence that went on within David's household and the nation as a result of that sin. So the consequences were still there in a sense. But yet as a person he was able to live with an open heart before God because of that, because he knew grace in that way. So just to sum up for ourselves, lessons for ourselves. Watch out. watch out. When pride's there, when life's easy, when you've made it, watch out. God warned Cain, sin is crouching at your door and wants to be your master. When everything's rosy, watch out for the sin that's crouching at your door and wants to be your master. Watch what you do with your thoughts, with your eyes, with your looks, with your actions. Because understand that great moments of hurt for ourselves, for others, and for God are the consequence of a series of small steps. But in all of this, live as a person who delights in God's grace, in God's forgiveness, in God's cleansing, and God's ability to deal with us where we are. Whatever you're living through, wherever you're at, whatever the failings you have, you can be a person after God's own heart because we embrace His forgiveness and His grace. David and Goliath is one story. David and Bathsheba teach us something else. But something equally important for us to learn if we're to walk successfully.